The kamikaze, divine, or spirit wind, officially Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, abbreviated as Tokkō Tai, and used as a verb as tokka, were suicide attacks by military aviators from the Empire of Japan against Allied naval vessels in the closing stages of the Pacific Campaign of World War II, designed to destroy warships more effectively than was possible with conventional attacks. During World War II, about 3,860 kamikaze pilots were killed, and about 19% of kamikaze attacks managed to hit a ship. Kamikaze aircraft were essentially pilot-guided explosive missiles, purpose-built or converted from conventional aircraft. Pilots would attempt to crash their aircraft into enemy ships in what was called a body attack in planes laden with some combination of explosives, bombs, torpedoes and full fuel tanks. Accuracy was much better than a conventional attack, the payload and explosion larger. A kamikaze could sustain damage which would disable a conventional attacker and still achieve its objective. The goal of crippling or destroying large numbers of Allied ships, particularly aircraft carriers, was considered to be a just reason for sacrificing pilots and aircraft. These attacks, which began in October 1944, followed several critical military defeats for the Japanese. They had long lost aerial dominance due to outdated aircraft and the loss of experienced pilots. On a macroeconomic scale, Japan experienced a decreasing capacity to wage war, and a rapidly declining industrial capacity relative to the United States. The Japanese government expressed its reluctance to surrender. In combination, these factors led to the use of kamikaze tactics as Allied forces advanced towards the Japanese home islands. While the term kamikaze usually refers to the aerial strikes, it has also been applied to various other suicide attacks. The Japanese military also used or made plans for non-aerial Japanese special attack units, including those involving submarines, human torpedoes, speedboats and divers. The tradition of death instead of defeat, capture, and perceived shame was deeply entrenched in Japanese military culture. It was one of the primary traditions in the samurai life and the Bushido Code, loyalty and honor until death. Definition and etymology. The Japanese word kamikaze is usually translated as divine wind. The word originated as the name of major typhoons in 1274 and 1281, which dispersed Mongolian invasion fleets under Kublai Khan. In Japanese, the formal term used for units carrying out suicide attacks during 1944–1945 is Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, which literally means special attack unit. This is usually abbreviated to Tokkō Tai. More specifically, air suicide attack units from the Imperial Japanese Navy were officially called Shinpa Tokubetsu Kōgekitai. Shinpa is the on-reading of the same characters that form the word kamikaze in Japanese. During World War II, the pronunciation kamikaze was used in Japan only informally in relation to suicide attacks, but after the war this usage gained acceptance worldwide and was re-imported into Japan. As a result, the special attack units are sometimes known in Japan as kamikaze Tokubetsu Kōgekitai. History, background. Before the formation of kamikaze units, pilots had made deliberate crashes as a last resort when their planes had suffered severe damage and they did not want to risk being captured or wanted to do as much damage to the enemy as possible since they were crashing anyway. Such situations occurred in both the Japanese and Allied air forces. Exhale and Case see these suicides as individual, impromptu decisions by men who were mentally prepared to die. The alleged case of Nikolai Gastlostarin on June 26, 1941 passed into Soviet air warfare law. In most cases, little evidence exists that such hits represented more than accidental collisions of the kind that sometimes happen in intense sea or air battles. One example of this occurred on December 7, 1941 during the attack on Pearl Harbor. First Lieutenant Fusata Iida's plane had taken a hit and had started leaking fuel when he apparently used it to make a suicide attack on Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Before taking off, he had told his men that if his plane were to become badly damaged he would crash it into a worthy enemy target. The carrier battles in 1942, particularly Midway, inflicted irreparable damage on the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, such that they could no longer put together a large number of fleet carriers with well-trained air crews. Japanese planners had assumed a quick war and lacked comprehensive programs to replace the losses of ships, pilots, and sailors. At midway in June 1942, the Japanese lost as many aircrewmen in a single day as their pre-war training program had produced in a year. The following Solomon Islands campaign and the New Guinea campaign, notably the battles of Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, further decimated the IJNAS veteran air crews, and replacing their combat experience proved impossible. During 1943–1944, U.S. forces steadily advanced towards Japan. Newer U.S.-made planes, especially the F-6F Hellcat and F-4 Corsair, began to outnumber and outclass Japan's fighter planes. Tropical diseases, as well as shortages of spare parts and fuel, made operations more and more difficult for the IJNAS. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese had to make do with obsolete aircraft and inexperienced aviators in the fight against better-trained and more experienced U.S. Navy airmen who flew radar-directed combat air patrols. The Japanese lost over 400 carrier-based planes and pilots in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, effectively putting an end to their carriers' potency. Allied aviators called the action the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, planes from the carrier Chiyoda approached a U.S. task group. According to some accounts, 2 made suicide attacks, one of which hit Asa, Indiana. The important Japanese base of Saipan fell to the Allied forces on July 15, 1944. Its capture provided adequate forward bases which enabled U.S. air forces using the B-29 Superfortress to strike at the Japanese home islands. After the fall of Saipan, the Japanese High Command predicted that the Allies would try to capture the Philippines, strategically important to Tokyo because of their location between the oil fields of Southeast Asia and Japan. Beginnings: Captain Motoharu Okamura, in charge of the Takayama base in Tokyo, as well as the 341st Air Group Home, was, according to some sources, the first officer to officially propose kamikaze attack tactics. He arranged, with his superiors, the first investigations on the plausibility and mechanisms of intentional suicide attacks on June 15, 1944. In August 1944, it was announced by the Domyu news agency that a flight instructor named Akio Takata was training pilots in Taiwan for suicide missions. One source claims that the first kamikaze mission occurred on September 13, 1944. A group of pilots from the Army's 31st Fighter Squadron on Negros Island decided to launch a suicide attack the following morning. First Lieutenant Takeshi Kosai and a sergeant were selected. 2 100 kg bombs were attached to 2 fighters, and the pilots took off before dawn, planning to crash into carriers. They never returned, but there is no record of an enemy plane hitting an Allied ship that day. According to some sources, on October 14, 1944, Asa Reno was hit by a deliberately crashed Japanese plane. Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima, the commander of the 26th Air Flotilla, is sometimes credited with inventing the kamikaze tactic. Arima personally led an attack by about 100 Yokosuka D-4Y Swisei dive bombers against a large Essex-class aircraft carrier, Asa Franklin, near Leyte Gulf, on October 15, 1944. Arima was killed and part of a plane hit Franklin. The Japanese High Command and propagandists seized on Arima's example. He was promoted posthumously to admiral and was given official credit for making the first kamikaze attack. However, it is not clear that this was a planned suicide attack, and official Japanese accounts of Arima's attack bore little resemblance to the actual events. On October 17, 1944, Allied forces assaulted Suelen Island, beginning the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 1st Air Fleet, based at Manila, was assigned the task of assisting the Japanese ships which would attempt to destroy Allied forces in Leyte Gulf. However, the 1st Air Fleet at that time only had 40 aircraft, 34 A-6M0 carrier-based fighters, 3 Nakajima B-6N-10s and torpedo bombers, 1 Mitsubishi G4M and 2 Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga land-based bombers, and 1 additional reconnaissance plane. The task facing the Japanese air forces seemed impossible. The first Air Fleet Commandant, Vice Admiral Takajiro Enishi, decided to form a suicide offensive force, the Special Attack Unit. In a meeting at Mabalicat Airfield near Manila, on October 19, Onishi told officers of the 201st Flying Group headquarters, "I don't think there would be any other certain way to carry out the operation, to hold the Philippines, than to put a 250 kg bomb on a Zero and let it crash into a U.S. carrier, in order to disable her for a week." First Unit, Commander Asaaki Tomei asked a group of 23 talented student pilots, all of whom he had trained, to volunteer for the Special Attack Force. All of the pilots raised both of their hands, volunteering to join the operation. Later, Tomei asked Lieutenant Yukio Seki to command the Special Attack Force. Seki is said to have closed his eyes, lowered his head and thought for 10 seconds, before saying, "Please do appoint me to the post." Seki became the 24th kamikaze pilot to be chosen. However, Seki later said, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. And I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." The names of 4 subunits within the Kamikaze Special Attack Force were Unit Shikishima, Unit Yamato, Unit Asai, and Unit Yamazakura. These names were taken from a patriotic death poem, Shikishima no Yamato Gokuro Ohito Tawaba, Asahi ni no Yamazakura Bana by the Japanese classical scholar, Motori Norinaga. The poem reads, "If someone asks about the Yamato spirit, spirit of old true Japan of Shikishima, a poetic name for Japan it is the flowers of Yamazakura, mountain cherry blossom that are fragrant in the Asai, rising sun." A less literal translation is, "Asked about the soul of Japan, I would say, that it is, like wild cherry blossoms, glowing in the morning sun." OENISHI, addressing this unit, told them that their nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin even in defeat. Late Gulf, the first attacks. Several suicide attacks, carried out during the invasion of Leyte, by Japanese pilots from units other than the Special Attack Force, have been described as the first kamikaze attack. Early on October 21, a Japanese aircraft, possibly an Aki D-3A dive bomber or a Mitsubishi Ki-51 deliberately crashed into the foremast of the heavy cruiser Himase Australia. The attack killed 30 personnel, including the cruiser's captain, Emile D. Cheney, and wounded 64, including the Australian Force Commander Commodore John Collins. The Australian official history of the war claimed that this was the first kamikaze attack on an Allied ship, although other sources disagree because it was not a planned attack by a member of the Special Attack Force, but was most likely to have been undertaken on the pilot's own initiative. The sinking of the ocean tug USS Sonoma on October 24 is listed in some sources as the first ship lost to a kamikaze strike, but the attack occurred before October 25, and the aircraft used, a Mitsubishi G4M, was not flown by the original 4 Special Attack Squadrons. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Kamikaze Special Attack Force carried out its first mission. 5 Zeros, led by Seki, and escorted to the target by leading Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, attacked several escort carriers. 1 Zero attempted to hit the bridge of Usakit-kun Bay but instead exploded on the port catwalk and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 others dived at Usa Fanshul Bay but were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The last 2 ran at Usa White Plains. 1, under heavy fire and trailing smoke, aborted the attempt on White Plains and instead banked toward Usa St. Lo, plowing into the flight deck. Its bomb caused fires that resulted in the bomb magazine exploding, sinking the carrier. By day's end on October 26, 55 kamikazes from the Special Attack Force had also damaged the large escort carriers Usa Sanjaman, Sune, which had also been struck by a kamikaze at 8:04 forward of its aft elevator on October 25, Santee, and the smaller escorts USS White Plains, Kalinin Bay, and Kitkun Bay. In total, 7 carriers had been hit, as well as 40 other ships. Main wave of attacks. Early successes such as the sinking of St. Lo were followed by an immediate expansion of the program, and over the next few months over 2,000 planes made such attacks. When Japan began to be subject to intense strategic bombing by B-29s, the Japanese military attempted to use suicide attacks against this threat. During the Northern Hemisphere winter of 1944–45, the IJAAF formed the 47th Air Regiment, also known as the Shinton Special Unit at Narimasu Airfield, Nerima, Tokyo, to defend the Tokyo metropolitan area. The unit was equipped with Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki fighters, with which they were to ram United States Army Air Force's B-29s in their attacks on Japan. However, this proved much less successful and practical since an airplane is a much faster, more maneuverable, and smaller target than a warship. The B-29 also had formidable defensive weaponry, so suicide attacks against the plane demanded considerable piloting skill to be successful. That worked against the very purpose of using expendable pilots, and even encouraging capable pilots to bail out before impact was ineffective because vital personnel were often lost when they mistimed their exits and were killed as a result. On March 11, the U.S. carrier Asa Randolph was hit and moderately damaged at Ulithi Atoll, in the Caroline Islands, by a kamikaze that had flown almost 4,000 km from Japan, in a mission called Operation Tan No. 2. On March 20, the submarine Usa Devilfish survived a hit from an aircraft, just off Japan. Purpose-built kamikaze planes, as opposed to converted fighters and dive bombers, were also being constructed. Ensign Mitsuo Ota had suggested that piloted glider bombs, carried within range of targets by a mother plane, should be developed. The first Naval Air Technical Bureau, in Yokosuka, refined Ota's idea. Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket planes, launched from bombers, were first deployed in kamikaze attacks from March 1945. U.S. personnel gave them the derisive nickname Barker bombs. The Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi was a simple, easily built propeller aircraft with a wooden airframe which used engines from existing stocks. Its non-retractable landing gear was jettisoned shortly after takeoff for a suicide mission, and reused. During 1945, the Japanese military began stockpiling hundreds of Tsurugi, other aircraft, Okas, and suicide boats, for use against Allied forces expected to invade Japan. The invasion never happened, and few were ever used. Allied defensive tactics. In early 1945, U.S. Navy aviator Commander John Thatch, already famous for developing effective aerial tactics against the Japanese such as the Thatch Weave, developed a defensive strategy against kamikazes called the Big Blue Blanket to establish Allied air supremacy well away from the carrier force. This recommended combat air patrols which were larger and operated further from the carriers than before, a line of picket destroyers and destroyer escorts at least 80 km from the main body of the fleet to provide earlier radar interception, and improved coordination between fighter direction officers on carriers. This plan also called for round-the-clock fighter patrols over Allied fleets, though the U.S. Navy had cut back training of fighter pilots so there were not enough Navy pilots available to counter the kamikaze threat. A final element included intensive fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields, and bombing of Japanese runways, using delayed action bombs to make repairs more difficult. Late in 1944 the British Pacific Fleet used the good high-altitude performance of their Supermarine Seafires on combat air patrol duties. Seafires were heavily involved in countering the kamikaze attacks during the Iwo Jima landings and beyond. The Seafire's best day was August 15, 1945, shooting down 8 attacking aircraft for a single loss. Allied pilots were experienced and better trained, and flew superior aircraft, making the poorly trained kamikaze pilots easy targets. The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force alone could bring over 1,000 fighter aircraft into play. Allied pilots became adept at destroying enemy aircraft before they struck ships. Allied gunners had begun to develop techniques to negate kamikaze attacks. Light rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons such as the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon autocannons were highly effective, but heavy anti-aircraft guns such as the 5 inches /38 caliber gun had the punch to blow kamikazes out of the air, which was preferable since even a heavily damaged kamikaze could complete its mission. The Okas with their high speed presented a very difficult problem for anti-aircraft fire, since their velocity made a fire control solution extremely difficult. By 1945, large numbers of anti-aircraft shells with radio frequency proximity fuses, on average 7 times more effective than regular shells, became available, and the USN recommended their use against kamikaze attacks. Final phase. The peak in kamikaze attacks came during the period of April–June 1945, at the Battle of Okinawa. On April 6, 1945, waves of planes made hundreds of attacks in Operation Kikizui. At Okinawa, kamikaze attacks focused at first on Allied destroyers on picket duty, and then on the carriers in the middle of the fleet. Suicide attacks by planes or boats at Okinawa sank or put out of action at least 30 U.S. warships, and at least 3 U.S. merchant ships, along with some from other Allied forces. The attacks expended 1,465 planes. Many warships of all classes were damaged, some severely, but no aircraft carriers, battleships or cruisers were sunk by kamikaze at Okinawa. Most of the ships lost were destroyers or smaller vessels, especially those on picket duty. The destroyer Usalafi earned the nickname the ship that would not die after surviving 6 kamikaze attacks and 4 bomb hits during this battle. U.S. carriers, with their wooden flight decks, appeared to suffer more damage from kamikaze hits than the reinforced steel-decked carriers from the British Pacific Fleet. U.S. carriers also suffered considerably heavier casualties from kamikaze strikes. For instance, 389 men were killed in one attack on Usa Bunker Hill, greater than the combined number of fatalities suffered on all 6 Royal Navy armored carriers from all forms of attack during the entire war. 8 kamikaze hits on 5 British carriers resulted in only 20 deaths while a combined total of 15 bomb hits, most of 500 kg weight or greater, and 1 torpedo hit on 4 carriers caused 193 fatal casualties earlier in the war, striking proof of the protective value of the armored flight deck. The resilience of well-armored vessels was shown on May 4, just after 11:30, when there was a wave of suicide attacks against the BPF. One Japanese plane made a steep dive from a great height at the carrier HMSA Formidable and was engaged by AA guns. Although it was hit by gunfire, the kamikaze crashed into the flight deck, making a crater 3 am long, 0.6 am wide and 0.6 am deep. A long steel splinter speared down, through the hangar deck and the main boiler room, before coming to rest in a fuel tank near the aircraft park, where it started a major fire. 8 personnel were killed and 47 were wounded. 1 caisson and 10 Avengers were destroyed. However, the fires were gradually brought under control, and the crater in the deck was repaired with concrete and steel plate. By 1700, caissons were able to land. On May 9, Formidable was again damaged by a kamikaze, as were the carrier HMSA Victorious and the battleship HMSA Howe. The British were able to clear the flight deck and resume flight operations in just hours, while their American counterparts took a few days or even months, as observed by a USN liaison officer on HMSA Indefatigable who commented, "When a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier it means 6 months of repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier unregistered trademark S just a case of sweepers, man your brooms." Sometimes twin-engined aircraft were used in planned kamikaze attacks. For example, Mitsubishi Ki-67 medium bombers, based on Formosa, undertook kamikaze attacks on Allied forces off Okinawa. Rear Admiral Motomagaki, the second in command of the combined Pacific Fleet, directed the last official kamikaze attack, sending Judis from the 701st Air Group against the Allied fleet at Okinawa on August 15, 1945. Effects. As the end of the war approached, the Allies did not suffer significantly more serious losses, despite having far more ships and facing a greater intensity of kamikaze attacks. Although causing some of the heaviest casualties on U.S. carriers in 1945, The IJN had sacrificed 2,525 kamikaze pilots and the IJAAF 1,387 euro, far more than they had lost in 1942 when they sank or crippled 3 carriers. In 1942, when U.S. Navy vessels were scarce, the temporary absence of key warships from the combat zone would tie up operational initiatives. However, by 1945, the U.S. Navy was large enough that damaged ships could be detached back home for repair without significantly hampering the fleet's operational capability. The only surface losses were destroyers and smaller ships that lacked the capability to sustain heavy damage. Overall, the kamikazes were unable to turn the tide of the war and stop the Allied invasion. The destructive potential of the kamikaze sustained post-war funding of Operation Bumblebee until the RIM-8 Talos guided missile became operational in 1959. In the immediate aftermath of kamikaze strikes, British carriers with their armored flight decks appeared to recover more quickly compared to their U.S. counterparts. However, post-war analysis showed that some British carriers such as HMS Formidable did suffer structural damage that led them to be written off and scrapped, as beyond economic repair, but Britain's dire post-war finances and the constantly declining size of the Royal Navy undoubtedly played a role in deciding not to repair damaged carriers. By contrast, even the most seriously damaged American carriers such USS Bunker Hill were successfully repaired to operational condition, although they saw no service after World War II as they were considered surplus. The number of ships sunk is a matter of debate. According to a wartime Japanese propaganda announcement, the mission sank 81 ships and damaged 195, and according to a Japanese tally, kamikaze attacks accounted for up to 80% of the U.S. losses in the final phase of the war in the Pacific. In a 2004 book, World War II, the historians Wilmot, Cross and Messenger stated that more than 70 U.S. vessels were sunk or damaged beyond repair by kamikazes. According to a U.S. Air Force webpage, approximately 2,800 kamikaze attackers sunk 34 Navy ships, damaged 368 others, killed 4,900 sailors, and wounded over 4,800. Despite radar detection and cueing, airborne interception, attrition, and massive anti-aircraft barrages, 14% of kamikazes survived to score a hit on a ship. Nearly 8.5% of all ships hit by kamikazes sank. Australian journalists Dennis and Peggy Warner, in a 1982 book with Japanese naval historian Sadao Seno, arrived at a total of 57 ships sunk by kamikazes. However, Bill Gordon, an American Japanologist who specializes in kamikazes, lists in a 2007 article 47 ships known to have been sunk by kamikaze aircraft. Gordon says that the Warners and Seno included 10 ships that did not sink. He lists 3 escort carriers, USS St. Lo, USS Omani Bay, and USS Bismarck Sea, 14 destroyers, including the last ship to be sunk, USS Kalagana, DD-792, on July 29, 1945, off Okinawa, 3 high-speed transport ships, 5 landing ship, tank, 4 landing ship medium, 3 landing ship medium, 1 auxiliary tanker, 3 Canadian Victory ships, 3 Liberty ships, 2 high-speed minesweepers, 1 Hawk-class minesweeper, 1 submarine chaser, 2 PT boats, 2 landing craft support, recruitment. It was claimed by the Japanese forces at the time that there were many volunteers for the suicidal forces. Captain Motoharu Okamura commented that there were so many volunteers for suicide missions that he referred to them as a swarm of bees, explaining, "Bees die after they have stung." Okamura is credited with being the first to propose the kamikaze attacks. He had expressed his desire to lead a volunteer group of suicide attacks some 4 months before Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the Japanese Naval Air Forces in the Philippines, presented the idea to his staff. While Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, was inspecting the 341st Air Group, Captain Okamura took the chance to express his ideas on crash dive tactics. In our present situation, I firmly believe that the only way to swing the war in our favor is to resort to crash dive attacks with our planes. There is no other way. There will be more than enough volunteers for this chance to save our country, and I would like to command such an operation. Provide me with 300 planes and I will turn the tide of war. When the volunteers arrived for duty in the Corps, there were twice as many persons than there were aircraft. After the war, some commanders would express regret for allowing superfluous crews to accompany sorties, sometimes squeezing themselves aboard bombers and fighters so as to encourage the suicide pilots and, it seems, join in the exultation of sinking a large enemy vessel. Many of the kamikaze pilots believed their death would pay the debt they owed and show the love they had for their families, friends, and emperor. So eager were many minimally trained pilots to take part in suicide missions that when their sorties were delayed or aborted, the pilots became deeply despondent. Many of those who were selected for a body-crashing mission were described as being extraordinarily blissful immediately before their final sortie. As time wore on, however, modern critics questioning the nationalist portrayal of kamikaze pilot as noble soldiers willing to sacrifice their lives for the country have emerged. In 2006, Tsuneo Watanabe, editor-in-chief of the Yomiuri Shimbun, criticized Japanese nationalists' glorification of kamikaze attacks. It's all a lie that they left filled with braveness and joy, crying, "Long live the emperor." They were sheep at a slaughterhouse. Everybody was looking down and tottering. Some were unable to stand up and were carried and pushed into the plane by maintenance soldiers. Training. When you eliminate all thoughts about life and death, you will be able to totally disregard your earthly life. This will also enable you to concentrate your attention on eradicating the enemy with unwavering determination, meanwhile reinforcing your excellence in flight skills. Tokkō Tai pilot training, as described by Kasuga Takio, generally consisted of incredibly strenuous training, coupled with cruel and torturous corporal punishment as a daily routine. Irakawa Dakichi, who trained at Sakura Naval Air Base, recalled that he was struck on the face so hard and frequently that his face was no longer recognizable. He also wrote, "I was hit so hard that I could no longer see and fell on the floor. The minute I got up, I was hit again by a club so that I would confess." This brutal training was justified by the idea that it would instill a soldier's fighting spirit. However, daily beatings and corporal punishment eliminated patriotism among many pilots. Pilots were given a manual which detailed how they were supposed to think, prepare and attack. From this manual, pilots were told to attain a high level of spiritual training, and to keep their health in the very best condition. These things, among others, were meant to put the pilot into the mindset in which he would be mentally ready to die. The Tokkō Tai pilot's manual also explained how a pilot may turn back if the pilot could not locate a target and that a pilot should not waste his life lightly. However, one pilot who continually came back to base was shot after his 9th return. The manual was very detailed in how a pilot should attack. A pilot would dive towards his target and aim for a point between the bridge tower and the smokestacks. Entering a smokestack was also said to be effective. Pilots were told not to aim at a ship's bridge tower or gun turret but instead to look for elevators or the flight deck to crash into. For horizontal attacks, the pilot was to aim at the middle of the vessel, slightly higher than the waterline, or to aim at the entrance to the aircraft hangar, or the bottom of the stack if the former was too difficult. The Tokkō Tai pilot's manual told pilots never to close their eyes. This was because if a pilot closed his eyes he would lower the chances of hitting his target. In the final moments before the crash, the pilot was to yell "Hisatsu" at the top of his lungs, which translates to certain kill. Cultural background. In 1944–45, American propaganda invented the term state Shinto to characterize Japanese beliefs. As time went on, Americans claimed Shinto was used increasingly in the promotion of nationalist sentiment. In 1890, the Imperial Rescript on Education was passed, under which students were required to ritually recite its oath to offer themselves courageously to the state as well as protect the imperial family. The ultimate offering was to give up an unregistered trademark's life. It was an honor to die for Japan and the emperor. Exale and Case pointed out, the fact is that innumerable soldiers, sailors and pilots were determined to die, to become ere, that is a Euro Guardian Spirites, a Euro unregistered trademark of the country. Many Japanese felt that to be enshrined at Yasukuni was a special honor because the emperor twice a year visited the shrine to pay homage. Yasukuni is the only shrine, deifying common men, which the emperor would visit to pay his respects. Young Japanese people were indoctrinated from an earlier stage with these ideals. Following the commencement of the kamikaze tactic, newspapers and books ran advertisements, articles, and stories regarding the suicide bombers, to aid in recruiting and support. In October 1944, the Nippon Times quoted Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, "The spirit of the Special Attack Corps is the great spirit that runs in the blood of every Japanese Euro. The crashing action which simultaneously kills the enemy and oneself without fail is called the Special Attack Euro. Every Japanese is capable of becoming a member of the Special Attack Corps." Publishers also played up the idea that the kamikaze were enshrined at Yasukuni and ran exaggerated stories of kamikaze bravery. There were even fairy tales for little children that promoted the kamikaze. A Foreign Office official named Toshikazu said, "It was customary for GHQ, in Tokyo to make false announcements of victory and utter disregard of facts, and for the elated and complacent public to believe them." While many stories were falsified, some were true, such as the story of Keiyu Ishikawa, who saved a Japanese ship when he crashed his plane into a torpedo that an American submarine had launched. The sergeant major was posthumously promoted to second lieutenant by the emperor and was enshrined at Yasukuni. Stories like these, which showed the kind of praise and honor death produced, encouraged young Japanese to volunteer for the Special Attack Corps and instilled a desire in the youth to die as a kamikaze. Ceremonies were carried out before kamikaze pilots departed on their final mission. The kamikaze shared ceremonial cups of sake or water known as Mizano Sakazuki. Many army kamikaze took their swords with them, if they were officers, while the Navy pilots didn't carry swords in their planes. The kamikaze, like all Japanese aviators flying over unfriendly territory, were issued a Nambu pistol with which to end their lives if they risked being captured. Like all Army and Navy servicemen, the kamikaze would wear their senninbari, a belt of 1,000 stitches given to them by their mothers. They also composed and read a death poem, a tradition stemming from the samurai, who did it before committing seppuku. Pilots carried prayers from their families and were given military decorations. The kamikaze were escorted by other pilots whose function was to protect the kamikaze to their destination and report on the results. Some of these escort pilots, such as Zero pilot Toshimitsu Umaizumi, were they themselves later sent out on their own kamikaze missions. While commonly perceived that volunteers signed up in droves for kamikaze missions, it has also been contended that there was extensive coercion and peer pressure involved in recruiting soldiers for this sacrifice. Their motivations in volunteering were complex and not simply about patriotism or bringing honor to their families. First-hand interviews with surviving kamikaze pilots and escort pilots has revealed that they were motivated by a desire to protect their families from perceived atrocities and possible extinction at the hands of the Allies. They viewed themselves as the last defense. And at least one of these pilots was a conscripted Korean with a Japanese name, adopted under the pre-war Soshi Keimyu Ordinance that compelled Koreans to take Japanese personal names. 11 of the 1,036 IJA kamikaze pilots who died in sorties from Chiron and other Japanese air bases during the Battle of Okinawa were Koreans. It is said that young pilots on kamikaze missions often flew southwest from Japan over the 922 am Mount Kamon. The mountain is also called Satsuma Fuji. Suicide mission pilots looked over their shoulders to see this, the most southern mountain on the Japanese mainland, while they were in the air, said farewell to their country, and saluted the mountain. Residents on Kikeshima Island, east of Amami Oeshima, say that pilots from suicide mission units dropped flowers from the air as they departed on their final missions. It is said that the hills above Kikeshima Airport have beds of cornflower that bloom in early May. Kamikaze pilots who were unable to complete their mission were stigmatized in the years following the war. This stigma began to diminish some 50 years after the war as scholars and publishers have distributed the survivors' stories. With the passing of time, some prominent Japanese military figures who survived the war became critical of the policy. Saburo Sakai, an IJN ace, said, "A kamikaze is a surprise attack, according to our ancient war tactics. Surprise attacks will be successful the first time, maybe 2 or 3 times. But what fool would continue the same attacks for 10 months? Emperor Hirohito must have realized it. He should have said stop. Even now, many faces of my students come up when I close my eyes. So many students are gone. Why did headquarters continue such silly attacks for 10 months? Fools. Gender, who went to America? All those men lied that all men volunteered for kamikaze units. They lied." Quotations. "I cannot predict the outcome of the air battles, but you will be making a mistake if you should regard special attack operations as normal methods. The right way is to attack the enemy with skill and return to the base with good results. A plane should be utilized over and over again. Fata unregistered trademark is the way to fight a war. The current thinking is skewed. Otherwise, you cannot expect to improve air power. There will be no progress if flyers continue to die." A Lieutenant Commander Iwatani, Taiyo Magazine, March 1945. Suelen wanen och in mine, hits, n. After all, I am just a human being. Sometimes, my chest pounds with excitement when I think of the day I will fly into the sky. I trained my mind and body as hard as I could and am anxious for the day I can use them to their full capacity in fighting. I think my life and death belong to the mission. Yet, at other times, I envy those science majors who remain at home, exempt from the draft. One of my souls looks to heaven, while the other is attracted to the earth. I wish to enter the Navy as soon as possible so that I can devote myself to the task. I hope that the days when I am tormented by stupid thoughts will pass quickly." Sasaki Hashiro. It is easy to talk about death in the abstract, as the ancient philosophers discussed. But it is real death I fear, and I don't unregistered trademark to know if I can overcome the fear. Even for a short life, there are many memories. For someone who had a good life, it is very difficult to part with it. But I reached a point of no return. I must plunge into an enemy vessel. To be honest, I cannot say that the wish to die for the Emperor is genuine, coming from my heart. However, it is decided for me that I die for the Emperor. Hayashi Aikizo. I am pleased to have the honor of having been chosen as a member of a special attack force that is on its way into battle, but I cannot help crying when I think of you, Mum. When I reflect on the hopes you had for my future. I feel so sad that I am going to die without doing anything to bring you joy. Aikizo Hayashi, last letter home a few days before his final flight. April 1945. Film, Saigo no Tokkō Tai, released in 1970, produced by Toei, directed by Junya Sato and starring Koji Tsurita, Ken Takakura and Shinichi Chiba. Toei also produced a biographical film about Takajiro Enishi in 1974 called Kessen Kaka Tai, directed by Kazaku Yamashita. Masami Takahashi, Last Kamikaze Testimonials from WWII Suicide Pilots. Risa Morimoto, Wings of Defeat. Owakami no Tomini Koso. See also, Aerial Ramming, Churin Special Attack Peace Museum, Jiretsu, Leonidas Squadron, Living Torpedoes, Ram Commando ELBE, Shige Kono, Suicide Weapon, Yumi Yukuba, Vehicle Explosion, List of Imperial Japanese Navy Air-to-Surface Special Attack Units, List of Imperial Japanese Army Air-to-Surface Special Attack Units, References, Notes. Bibliography. Further reading, Onuki Tierney, Emiko. Kamikaze Diaries, Reflections of Japanese Student Soldiers. University of Chicago Press. ISBN A978-0-226-61951-4, Onuki Tierney, Emiko. Kamikaze, Cherry Blossoms, and Nationalisms, The Militarization of Aesthetics in Japanese History. University of Chicago Press. ISBN A978-0-226-62091-6. Rielly, Robin L. Kamikaze Attacks of World War II, A Complete History of Japanese Suicide Strikes on American Ships, by Aircraft and Other Means. McFarland. ISBN A978-0-7864-4654-4. Stern, Robert. Fire from the Sky, Surviving the Kamikaze Threat. Naval Institute Press. ISBN A978-1-59114-267-6. External links, Kamikaze images, personal website of Mr. Nobu Day off kamikaze.com, an ex-kamikaze pilot creates a new world, Gyokusai, who became kamikaze pilots. The Kamikaze Pilot Who Chose Life Before Empire, excerpt from Kamikaze Diaries, The End of Kamikaze, Day of the Kamikaze, Smithsonian Networks, Ascent of the Fireflies, Time About Tom Toriyama called Kamikaze Mum, WW2DB, Kamikaze Doctrine, What Motivated the Kamikazes? On www.history.com, Kamikaze Pilot Strikes USS Essex, November 25, 1944. Torpedo bomber pilot recalls the experience of a kamikaze striking the USS Essex, November 25, 1944.